love eternal. The restaurant was awash in soft pink hues, its corners filled with flickering candlelight and murmurs of couples leaning close, exchanging whispers and smiles. Ellie adjusted her dress, a deep crimson satin, and tucked a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. Across the table, her boyfriend Mark reached for her hand, his fingers warm and reassuring. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said, smiling as his thumb brushed her knuckles. "Happy Valentine's Day," she replied, trying to match his smile. The truth was, Ellie had felt uneasy all evening, though she couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't Mark. He was as attentive as ever, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners every time he laughed. It wasn't the restaurant either. It was the kind of place she would usually adore, with its rustic charm and soft piano music in the background. And yet, there it was, that subtle but growing discomfort like a spider crawling just out of sight. Mark leaned forward, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? The moment she'd been dreaming of? Her discomfort wavered, replaced by a flicker of anticipation. "I've been waiting for the right time," Mark began, his voice soft but trembling with emotion. He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold bracelet, not a ring. Ellie felt a pang of disappointment but pushed it aside. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched as he clasped it around her wrist. "An eternal bond," Mark said with a quiet intensity that made her shiver. His smile lingered too long, almost stretching into something unnatural. She forced herself to focus on the gift. The bracelet was exquisite, its intricate links forming delicate hearts. But as she looked closer, Ellie noticed tiny scratches on its surface, faint but deliberate, as though someone had tried to claw their way out of it. A burst of laughter from a nearby table snapped her out of her thoughts. Mark was watching her intently, his expression unreadable. "You don't like it?" he asked. "No, I love it," she said quickly. "It's perfect." But something about the way he held her gaze made her stomach churn. Later that night, as they walked back to her apartment, the cold February air nipping at her cheeks, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. She glanced over her shoulder, but the cobblestone street was empty, save for the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, his hand resting on her lower back. "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. Once inside, she locked the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling. Mark was already in the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "To us," he said, handing her a glass and clinking it against hers. "To us?" she echoed, though her voice wavered. As they sat on the couch, Mark seemed different. His usual warmth felt off, like a mask slipping just enough to reveal something darker underneath. His smile was too wide, his laughter too sharp. And when he spoke about their future, his words carried a weight that made her feel trapped rather than cherished. She tried to dismiss her unease, chalking it up to her own overthinking. But as the night went on, the bracelet on her wrist began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. When she excused herself to the bathroom, she examined it more closely under the harsh light. The scratches she'd noticed earlier were deeper than she thought, forming what looked like tiny letters. Oh, her breath hitched. She tried to remove the bracelet, but the clasp wouldn't budge. It was as though it had fused to her skin. A knock at the bathroom door made her jump. "Everything okay in there?" Mark's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down her spine. "Yeah, just a minute," she called back, her voice trembling. When she finally emerged, Mark was standing unervingly close to the door, his smile gone. "You seemed upset," he said, his tone flat. "I'm fine," she insisted, brushing past him. But as the night wore on, her unease deepened. Strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air grew colder, heavy with an unspoken dread. Mark, however, acted as though nothing was wrong, his demeanor growing eerier by the hour. At one point, Ellie thought she heard faint whispers coming from the bracelet. By the time midnight rolled around, Ellie was desperate for an escape. She feigned exhaustion, hoping Mark would leave, but he insisted on staying the night. "I don't want you to be alone," he said, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. She barely slept, her mind racing with fear. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with images of writhing bodies, clawing hands, and a voice whispering, "He'll never let you go." She woke with a start, her wrist burning where the bracelet sat. In the dim light, she saw Mark sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at her. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Watching you," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're so beautiful when you sleep." She tried to sit up, but he pressed a hand to her shoulder, keeping her down. "Don't fight it, Ellie," he said, his tone soft but chilling. "This is what love is." An eternal bond. Forever. Panic surged through her as she realized she couldn't move. The bracelet tightened around her wrist, its metal digging into her skin. "Mark, stop," she cried, but his expression was vacant, as though he were a puppet being controlled by something unseen. The room grew darker, the shadows converging around them. And then she saw them, faces in the darkness, twisted and screaming, their mouths forming the same word over and over. "Run." With a burst of adrenaline, Allie managed to push Mark off and scramble out of the bed. But as she ran for the door, she felt an invisible force pulling her back, the bracelet glowing faintly in the darkness. "You can't leave," Mark said, his voice overlapping with another deeper voice that echoed like a growl. "You're mine now. Just like the others." Ellie's gaze darted to the bracelet, the scratches now forming a single word that burned into her vision: souls. The next morning the apartment was quiet. The police found no trace of Allie, only Mark sitting at the kitchen table, smiling serenely. On his wrist was a new bracelet, its gold links pristine and shining in the sunlight. He hummed a tune as he sipped his coffee, the faint sound of whispers swirling around him. It was Valentine's Day again, and Mark had already begun planning his next gift. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. Hearts of the Hollow. The storm came in unexpectedly that evening, drenching the small New England town in a freezing rain that felt sharper than sleet. Lily stared out the window of her century-old house, her reflection pale and uneasy against the night. The Valentine's decorations she had put up, heart-shaped garlands and candles, seemed oddly out of place now, their cheerfulness swallowed by the oppressive weather. Her boyfriend Sam had insisted on a cozy night in. They had planned to celebrate with a quiet dinner, a bottle of red wine, and maybe a horror movie. It had sounded perfect, until everything started to feel wrong. Lily turned from the window and glanced at the dining room table, set for two. A bouquet of crimson roses sat in the center, their petals bruised from the cold. She frowned, the roses hadn't looked like that earlier. Sam had given them to her that morning, freshly cut and flawless. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. She tried to shake off her unease. "Sam?" she called, heading toward the kitchen. "Yeah?" His voice drifted back, but it sounded off, too distant, as though he wasn't just a room away. She stepped into the kitchen and froze. The room was empty. The stove was cold, the counters pristine. But on the center island sat a single object, a heart-shaped box of chocolates. It hadn't been there earlier. Lily's pulse quickened. She approached the box cautiously, her reflection warped in its glossy red surface. When she opened it, she gasped. The chocolates weren't chocolates at all. Each compartment held something grotesque: a tooth, a fingernail, a lock of hair. In the very center was something small and fleshy, pulsing faintly, almost like a human heart. She stumbled back, her breath hitching in her throat. "Do you like it?" She spun around. Sam was standing in the doorway, his silhouette black against the dim light of the hall. But something about him was wrong. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and his face. "Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped into the light and she stifled a scream. His eyes were empty sockets, gaping black holes that seemed to pull the light from the room. His smile stretched impossibly wide, his teeth sharp and too numerous. "What's wrong?" he asked, tilting his head. "Don't you like your gift?" Lily backed away, her hand brushing against the box of horrors. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This isn't real," she murmured, shaking her head. "This isn't real." Sam, or whatever was wearing his skin, took another step forward. The air around him seemed to hum, the shadows deepening. "I went to so much trouble for you," he said, his voice layered with something guttural and inhuman. "I thought you'd appreciate the sentiment." He moved closer, his hand outstretched. His fingers were unnaturally long, ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Lily bolted. She ran through the dining room, knocking over the table in her haste. Candles toppled to the floor, their flames sputtering out. The house seemed darker now, the walls closer, as if the very structure was alive and watching her. She reached the front door and yanked it open, only to freeze. The street outside was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of black, dotted with faint, glowing red lights that pulsed like dying stars. The rain had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. "Where are you going, Lily?" She turned to see Sam standing at the base of the stairs, his form flickering like a glitching video. "You're mine now," he said, his smile splitting his face in two. "You always have been." She screamed and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the wood, her mind racing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Then she heard it, a soft rhythmic thumping. She looked down and gasped. The heart-shaped box had followed her. It sat at her feet, its lid now open wider than it should have been, as though it were alive. A faint whisper came from inside, calling her name over and over. Lily, Lily, Lily. She kicked the box away, but it slid across the floor and stopped, unnervingly deliberate. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, pleading and angry. Let me out. The box cracked open, spilling its contents onto the floor. Teeth and hair scattered across the wood, but it was the heart in the center that captured her attention. It began to grow, pulsing faster and faster, veins snaking outward like roots. Lily screamed as the heart erupted, spilling a black, viscous substance that spread across the floor, climbing the walls and ceiling. The house groaned as if in pain, the walls twisting and warping. Why are you running, Lily? She spun around to see Sam, or what was left of him. His body was stretched and distorted, his limbs too long, his skin peeling away to reveal glistening muscle and bone. His eyes, once empty sockets, now glowed red, matching the pulsing lights outside. You said you loved me, he whispered, his voice echoing from every corner of the room. And love is forever. The black substance reached her feet, coiling around her ankles like living chains. She struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter it held. Please, she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. You will, he said, his voice cold and final. You will? The blackness surged upward, swallowing her whole. Weeks later, the house was listed for sale. No one knew what had happened to Lily or Sam. They had simply vanished. The realtor tidied up the living room, pausing to admire the charming heart-shaped box left on the mantel. It was the perfect Valentine's touch for the open house. As she turned to leave, the box shifted slightly, its lid opening just a crack. Inside, something small and fleshy began to beat. Brace yourself, because the next story is even more disturbing. Let's move on to the second story, and trust me, this one will keep you up at night. The Crimson Letter. The smell of roses filled the air, mingling with the warm aroma of garlic bread as Diana stirred the simmering pot of pasta sauce. It was Valentine's Day, and she had gone all out. Candles flickered on the dining table, soft jazz played from the speaker in the corner, and a bottle of red wine sat uncorked, breathing on the counter. She glanced at the clock. 7:02 p.m. Eric was late. Not that it was unusual. Her boyfriend's job as a sales manager often kept him running behind schedule, but tonight she had hoped he'd make an effort. He'd promised. Still, Diana tried to suppress the irritation that bubbled in her chest. She reminded herself that relationships required patience. She was about to text him when her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Eric. Be there in 10 minutes. Got you something special. Love you. Relief washed over her. She quickly replied with a heart emoji and set the phone down. Something special, she murmured with a smile. By the time Eric arrived, the food was ready, and Diana had lit the last of the candles. He entered with a gust of cold air, carrying a small, wrapped box and wearing that lopsided grin she loved. His dark hair was damp from the drizzle outside, and his coat smelled faintly of rain. Hey babe, he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Happy Valentine's Day. Diana smiled, taking the box from him. Happy Valentine's Day. You're late. Worth the wait, I promise. She set the box on the table and gestured for him to sit. They ate together, laughing and chatting, the wine loosening their tongues and softening their edges. Everything felt perfect, almost too perfect. It wasn't until after dinner, when she opened his gift, that the first flicker of unease crept into her chest. Inside the box was a delicate gold locket, its surface etched with intricate floral designs. Oh, Eric, Diana breathed, lifting it carefully. It's beautiful. Open it, he urged, his grin faltering slightly. She fumbled with the tiny clasp, finally popping it open. Inside, on one side, was a small black and white photo of herself. On the other was a picture of Eric. Her brow furrowed. When did you take these? Eric shrugged, his tone casual. I found them online. Figured they'd fit perfectly in the locket. Something about his answer felt strange, but she didn't press. She slipped the locket around her neck, the chain cold against her skin. You like it? He asked, his voice a touch too eager. I love it, Diana said, though her tone lacked conviction. That night, Diana lay awake while Eric snored softly beside her. The locket rested on her chest, heavier than it should have been. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her dreams, when they came, were vivid and suffocating. She was running down a dark hallway, the walls closing in around her. At the end of the corridor stood Eric, his grin too wide, his eyes glinting like polished glass. He held out the locket, which now dripped with blood. When she woke, her heart was pounding. The bedroom was dark, save for the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand, 3:14 a.m. She turned toward Eric, but his side of the bed was empty. "Eric?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The house was silent, save for the creak of old wood settling in the walls. Diana slid out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The locket swung gently against her chest as she moved toward the door. "Eric?" she called again, louder this time. No answer. The hallway stretched before her, impossibly long in the dark. She could have sworn it hadn't felt this endless before. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed something strange. The pictures on the walls, the ones of her and Eric smiling at weddings and parties, had changed. In each frame Eric was smiling. But she wasn't. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. Diana's breath quickened as she hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing. The locket felt heavier with every step, the chain digging into her neck. When she reached the living room, she froze. Eric was sitting on the couch, his back to her. "Eric?" she said, relief and fear tangling in her throat. He didn't respond. As she approached, she noticed the flicker of a dim, orange light. A candle burned on the coffee table, casting shadows across the room. Eric was holding something in his lap, a piece of paper. "Eric, what are you doing?" Slowly he turned to look at her. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. The paper in his hands was covered in jagged handwriting, words scrawled so aggressively that they had torn through the page. "I didn't write this," he said hoarsely, holding it out to her. Diana hesitated before taking the paper. The words on it made her stomach drop. "You will be mine forever." "What is this?" she whispered, her hands trembling. "I found it in my jacket pocket," Eric said, his voice breaking. "I swear to God I didn't put it there." Before she could respond, the locket around her neck grew hot, searingly so. She screamed, clawing at it, but the clasp wouldn't budge. "Diana?" Eric lunged toward her, but as soon as his hand touched the locket, he recoiled as if burned. The room filled with the metallic stench of scorched flesh. The candle on the table extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. When Diana woke, she was alone. The locket was gone, but her neck throbbed with a raw, circular burn where it had been. "Eric?" she called, her voice barely audible. She found him in the bedroom. He was lying on the bed, motionless. For a moment she thought he was asleep. But when she touched his shoulder, his skin was ice cold. The police arrived an hour later. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation for Eric's death. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but Diana knew better. That night, as she sat alone in the empty house, she noticed something on the dining room table, a heart-shaped box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was the locket, its surface glinting ominously. Beneath it was a folded note. "Love never dies." The box snapped shut on its own and the lights went out. Ready for more nightmares? Here comes the second story. The Lovers' Pact. The snow fell steadily that Valentine's evening, muffling the sounds of the city outside Mia's apartment. Inside, the air was warm and rich with the smell of chocolate fondue. Candles flickered across the table, illuminating plates of strawberries, marshmallows, and cubes of cake. It was supposed to be the perfect Valentine's celebration, just her and her boyfriend, Ryan. Mia adjusted her red dress nervously as she checked her reflection in the window. She had put a lot of effort into tonight, more than usual. They had been dating for nearly a year and things had felt strained recently. She hoped tonight would fix that. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ryan. "Almost there. Got something special for tonight. Be ready." Mia smiled. Ryan wasn't always the most romantic, but he had his moments. Tonight would be one of them. When Ryan finally arrived, he brought the cold with him, shaking the snow from his coat as he stepped inside. In his hand was a small black box tied with a crimson ribbon. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said, kissing her cheek. "Happy Valentine's Day," she replied, smiling as she took the box. Inside was a silver ring with a red gemstone that gleamed like fresh blood. "It's beautiful," she said, slipping it onto her finger. "It fit perfectly." "I thought you'd like it," Ryan said, his smile a little too wide. "It's special." They settled in for dinner, laughing and reminiscing, but Mia couldn't shake the strange feeling that had crept in as soon as she put the ring on. It was as if the air in the apartment had grown heavier, the shadows deeper. And then there were the whispers. They started faintly, barely audible, like distant voices carried on the wind. At first, Mia thought it was her imagination, or maybe the sound of the radiator. But as the night went on, they grew louder. "Did you hear that?" she asked, glancing toward the living room. Hear what? Ryan said, his tone flat. Like voices? Ryan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're probably just tired. Mia frowned, her unease deepening. Something about his expression made her stomach twist. Later, as they sat on the couch, sipping wine, Mia tried to relax. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were persistent now, overlapping and urgent, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. The room felt colder despite the heater running. She pulled a blanket over her legs, glancing at Ryan, who was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, he said, his voice low. You're just perfect tonight? Mia forced a smile, her hand instinctively moving to the ring on her finger. It felt warm, almost as if it were alive. I need to use the bathroom, she said, standing abruptly. Ryan watched her go, his eyes following her every move. Once in the bathroom, she locked the door and leaned against the sink, her heart racing. She twisted the ring, trying to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the tiled walls. Help us? Mia froze. The words were clear now, spoken in multiple voices. Men, women, even children. Help us. Break the pact. What pact? She whispered, her voice trembling. But the whispers didn't answer. Instead, they grew frantic, overlapping into a cacophony that made her clap her hands over her ears. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Mia? Ryan's voice was calm but carried an edge that made her shudder. Are you okay? Yeah, she said quickly. I'll be out in a minute. Don't take too long, he said, his tone unnervingly even. When she finally emerged, Ryan was sitting on the couch, the candles casting long, flickering shadows across his face. He looked up at her, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. His eyes seemed darker, almost black, and his smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. You've been acting strange tonight, he said, patting the spot next to him. Come sit with me. Mia hesitated, the whispers now a constant drone in her ears. I think I need some air, she said, grabbing her coat. You're not leaving, Ryan said, his voice cold and final. Mia froze, her pulse hammering. What do you mean? Ryan stood slowly, his movements deliberate. You can't leave, Mia. Not tonight. Not after what we've done. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shaking. Ryan's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. The ring, he said, pointing to her hand. You accepted it. That means you're mine now. She looked down at the ring, which was glowing faintly. The whispers were deafening now, screaming at her to run, to break the pact, to destroy the ring. I didn't agree to anything, she said, backing away. But you did, Ryan said, his voice taking on an unnatural echo. When you put it on. That's the pact. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to close in on her. The shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that writhed and clawed at the walls. Mia bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. You can't leave, Ryan said, his voice distorted. You're part of it now. What is this? She screamed, tears streaming down her face. Ryan tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. Love is eternal, Mia. But so is the price. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him. When they receded, Ryan was gone. In his place stood a figure made of darkness, its eyes burning like coals. Break the ring, the voices screamed in unison. Mia didn't hesitate. She grabbed a candlestick from the table and slammed it against the ring, shattering the gemstone. The whispers stopped. The shadows froze. The air grew still. And then the figure screamed, a sound that shook the walls and rattled the windows. It dissolved into smoke, leaving behind nothing but silence. Mia collapsed to the floor, sobbing. The ring lay in pieces beside her, its metal tarnished and dull. When she finally looked around, the apartment was empty. Ryan was gone. But on the table, where the candlestick had been, was a single red rose. Its petals dripped with blood. Mia moved out of the apartment the next day, but no matter where she went, the rose would appear, on her nightstand, in her car, on the kitchen counter. She stopped sleeping. The whispers returned, faint but persistent. Love is eternal, they said. And on every Valentine's Day, the rose would bloom again, brighter and bloodier than before. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.